A German pilot pulled alongside a crippled B-17, unaware it would define both their lives on December 20, 1943, in the frozen air above Germany. A Luftwaffe fighter ace closed in on a dying 1-7 bomber and made a decision that violated every tactical principle of aerial warfare. The American crew aimed their remaining guns at him, waiting for death. Instead, Franz Stigler chose to become their escort, their shield, their only chance at survival. He was 1 kill away from the Knight's Cross. They were 10 men flying a wreck held together by rivets and prayer. Neither knew that 40 years later, they would meet again and discover that a single act of mercy had been burning in both their memories like an unexploded bomb. This is not a story about enemies becoming friends. This is about the instant one. A warrior looked through torn aluminum into the eyes of the dying and could not pull the trigger. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war's meaning for 2 men who lived through it, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The sky over Europe in late 1943 carried death on a scale the world had never measured. Strategic bombing had become industrial slaughter performed at 27,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero and oxygen came through rubber hoses that froze solid when breath condensed inside them. The United States had entered World War II with the conviction that bombers could win wars through precision strikes against industrial targets, that formations of heavy bombers flying in daylight could protect themselves through massed firepower, and enemy fighters would be unable to penetrate the overlapping fields of fire created by dozens of 50 caliber machine guns. This doctrine emerged from American confidence in technology and industrial capacity, from the belief that superior engineering could overcome any tactical disadvantage. The Air Corps' tactical school at Maxwell Field, Alabama, had spent the 1930s developing theories about strategic bombardment that assumed bombers would always get through, that accuracy would improve with practice, and that enemy defenses could be overwhelmed through sheer weight off numbers. By late 1943, combat experience over Europe had revealed these assumptions to be dangerously optimistic. German fighters had learned to attack from angles that minimized defensive fire exposure. Flak batteries had refined their techniques to create kill zones where bombers could not evade and survive. Luftwaffe pilots had discovered that head-on attacks into the bomber's nose, where only 1 or 2 guns could return fire, allowed them to close the lethal range before the bomber's defensive gunners could track them effectively. The commitment to daylight operations distinguished American doctrine from the British Royal Air Force, which had shifted to night bombing after suffering instrumental losses in daylight raids during 1940 and 1941. The Americans insisted that precision required visual targeting, that industrial complexes and transportation networks could only be hit accurately when bombardiers could see their targets through the northern bomb sight, and that the additional risk of daylight operations was justified by the increased probability of destroying specific facilities, rather than simply obliterating urban areas. This philosophical difference reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare, about whether it was possible to wage war against military and industrial targets without deliberately killing civilians, and about whether technology could provide solutions to tactical problems that had no technological answer. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress represented the pinnacle of American engineering confidence. Forwright R-182097. Cyclone radial engines producing 4,800 horsepower, a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches, and defensive armament that varied but typically included 11 Browning M250 caliber machine guns positioned at create overlapping fields of fire. The aircraft could carry 4,800 pounds of bombs to targets 800 miles distant and return. assuming the crew survived the gauntlet of fighters and flak that German defense had refined into a science of aerial interdiction. On paper, B-17s flying in tight box formations created a defensive sphere so lethal that enemy fighters could not penetrate it. In reality, German pilots learned to tack head-on into the formation's weakest arc, closing at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. FIR-ING cannon shells that could tear through aluminum like paper, and breaking away before defensive gunners could track them. The Luftwaffe understood that a bomber flying alone, damage-ed and slow, was already dead. The only question was who would claim the kill. Charles Lester Brown turned 21 years old on October 24, 1943, less than 2 months before his first combat mission as aircraft commander. He belonged to the generation that would later be called the Greatest Generation. Young men born in the early 1920s, who grew up during the Depression and came of age as the world descended into the largest war in human history. Brown's childhood in West Virginia had prepared him for hardship, for making do with limited resources, for solving troubles through patience and ingenuity rather than wealth or education. These were precisely the qualities that bomber pilots needed. Flying a B-17 in combat required technical skill, certainly, but it also required the ability to function under stress that would have broken most men. To make life or death decisions with incomplete information and no time for deliberation. And to hold together a crew of 10 men whose survival depended on coordinated action in conditions designed to create panic and confusion. The training pipeline that produced bomber pilots in 1943 was compressed, intensive, and designed to identify men who could fly heavy multi-engine aircraft while simultaneously managing crew operations, navigating over hostile territory, and maintaining formation discipline under fire. Brown had survived the training because he possessed natural aptitude for aviation and the kind of steady temperament that did not break under pressure. He came from Weston, West Virginia, a town where most boys learned to hunt before they learned to shave, and where the rhythm of seasons mattered more than the abstractions of global war until the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and the entire generation mobilized. Brown entered the United States Army Air Forces with a farm boy's understanding of machinery, patience, and the kind of quiet competence that came from fixing things that broke in places where help was miles away. By November 1943, he had completed pilot training and joined the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 379th Bombardment Group, a bomber command stationed at RAF Kimballton in England. The 379th flew B-17FS, and by late 1943, they were flying into increasingly fierce opposition as the Luftwaffe committed its remaining fighter strength to the defense of the Reich. Brown's crew consisted of 9 other men, whose lives would depend on his decisions in the next few hours. Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke served as co-dash pilot. Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok navigated. Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews operated radio and bombardier equipment. Staff Sergeant Bertrand Coulombe manned the top turret and served as flight engineer. The waist gunners, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, and radio operator formed the defensive perimeter that kept German fighters at bay or died trying. Their bomber, B-17F serial number 423167, carried the name the old pub painted on its nose. A bit of English pub nostalgia that seemed harmless enough when the aircraft arrived from Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant in June 1943. None of the crew knew that the aircraft's name would become synonymous with survival, mercy, and the strange mathematics of war that sometimes allowed 10 men to live when all probability said they should die. Franz Stigler was born August 21, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria, a medieval city that had survived centuries of European conflict and would barely survive the 20th centuries mechanized version. His generation inherited the trauma of Germany's defeat in World War I, the chaos of Weimar's collapse, hyperinflation that destroyed middle-class savings, political violence between communists and fascists in the streets, and the slow erosion of democratic institutions that culminated in Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. Stigler grew up in this environment, where economic desperation and national humiliation created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. But his own pathled through aviation rather than politics. He discovered flying in the early 1930s, when the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on German military aviation had created a civilian flying culture where a young man could learn to pilot aircraft without joining the banned Air Force. By the time the Luftwaffe was officially reconstituted in 1935, Stigler had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time, experiences that made him valuable to an organization that needed pilots more than it needed ideological purity. Commercial aviation in the 1930s required skills that would prove essential in combat: the ability to navigate long distances using celestial and radio navigation, to land aircraft in poor weather, to manage fuel consumption over extended flights, and to maintain situational awareness while operating complex machinery. These were not skills that could be quickly taught to novice pilots. And the Luftwaffe accounts that experienced civilian aviators like Stigler represented a resource too valuable to waste. Stigler grew up in the era of Weimar Germany's collapse, economic devastation, and the slow rise of National Socialism. He became a commercial airline pilot before the war, flying Lufthansa routes. A German pilot pulled alongside a crippled B-17, unaware it would define both their lives on December 20, 1943, in the frozen air above Germany. A Luftwaffe fighter ace closed in on a dying 1-7 bomber and made a decision that violated every tactical principle of aerial warfare. The American crew aimed their remaining guns at him, waiting for death. Instead, Franz Stigler chose to become their escort, their shield, their only chance at survival. He was 1 kill away from the Knight's Cross. They were 10 men flying a wreck held together by rivets and prayer. Neither knew that 40 years later, they would meet again and discover that a single act of mercy had been burning in both their memories like an unexploded bomb. This is not a story about enemies becoming friends. This is about the instant one. A warrior looked through torn aluminum into the eyes of the dying and could not pull the trigger. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war's meaning for 2 men who lived through it, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The sky over Europe in late 1943 carried death on a scale the world had never measured. Strategic bombing had become industrial slaughter performed at 27,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero and oxygen came through rubber hoses that froze solid when breath condensed inside them. The United States had entered World War II with the conviction that bombers could win wars through precision strikes against industrial targets, that formations of heavy bombers flying in daylight could protect themselves through massed firepower, and enemy fighters would be unable to penetrate the overlapping fields of fire created by dozens of 50 caliber machine guns. This doctrine emerged from American confidence in technology and industrial capacity, from the belief that superior engineering could overcome any tactical disadvantage. The Air Corps' tactical school at Maxwell Field, Alabama, had spent the 1930s developing theories about strategic bombardment that assumed bombers would always get through, that accuracy would improve with practice, and that enemy defenses could be overwhelmed through sheer weight off numbers. By late 1943, combat experience over Europe had revealed these assumptions to be dangerously optimistic. German fighters had learned to attack from angles that minimized defensive fire exposure. Flak batteries had refined their techniques to create kill zones where bombers could not evade and survive. Luftwaffe pilots had discovered that head-on attacks into the bomber's nose, where only one or two guns could return fire, allowed them to close the lethal range before the bomber's defensive gunners could track them effectively. The commitment to daylight operations distinguished American doctrine from the British Royal Air Force, which had shifted to night bombing after suffering instrumental losses in daylight raids during 1940 and 1941. The Americans insisted that precision required visual targeting, that industrial complexes and transportation networks could only be hit accurately when bombardiers could see their targets through the northern bomb sight, and that the additional risk of daylight operations was justified by the increased probability of destroying specific facilities, rather than simply obliterating urban areas. This philosophical difference reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare, about whether it was possible to wage war against military and industrial targets without deliberately killing civilians, and about whether technology could provide solutions to tactical problems that had no technological answer. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress represented the pinnacle of American engineering confidence. Forwright, R-182097. Cyclone radial engines producing 4,800 horsepower, a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches, and defensive armament that varied but typically included 11 Browning M250 caliber machine guns positioned at create overlapping fields of fire. The aircraft could carry 4,800 pounds of bombs to targets 800 miles distant and return. Assuming the crew survived the gauntlet of fighters and flak that German defense had refined into a science of aerial interdiction. On paper, B-17s flying in tight box formations created a defensive sphere so lethal that enemy fighters could not penetrate it. In reality, German pilots learned to attack head-on into the formation's weakest arc, closing at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. FIR-ING cannon shells that could tear through aluminum like paper, and breaking away before defensive gunners could track them. The Luftwaffe understood that a bomber flying alone, damaged and slow, was already dead. The only question was who would claim the kill. Charles Lester Brown turned 21 years old on October 24, 1943, less than 2 months before his first combat mission as aircraft commander. He belonged to the generation that would later be called the Greatest Generation. Young men born in the early 1920s, who grew up during the Depression and came of age as the world descended into the largest war in human history. Brown's childhood in West Virginia had prepared him for hardship, for making do with limited resources, for solving troubles through patience and ingenuity rather than wealth or education. These were precisely the qualities that bomber pilots needed. Flying a B-17 in combat required technical skill, certainly, but it also required the ability to function under stress that would have broken most men, to make life or death decisions with incomplete information and no time for deliberation, and to hold together a crew of 10 men whose survival depended on coordinated action in conditions designed to create panic and confusion. The training pipeline that produced bomber pilots in 1943 was compressed, intensive, and designed to identify men who could fly heavy multi-engine aircraft while simultaneously managing crew operations, navigating over hostile territory, and maintaining formation discipline under fire. Brown had survived the training because he possessed natural aptitude for aviation and the kind of steady temperament that did not break under pressure. He came from Weston, West Virginia, a town where most boys learned to hunt before they learned to shave, and where the rhythm of seasons mattered more than the abstractions of global war until the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and the entire generation mobilized. Brown entered the United States Army Air Forces with a farm boy's understanding of machinery, patience, and the kind of quiet competence that came from fixing things that broke in places where help was miles away. By November 1943, he had completed pilot training and joined the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 379th Bombardment Group, a bomber command stationed at RAF Kimballton in England. The 379th flew B-17FS, and by late 1943, they were flying into increasingly fierce opposition as the Luftwaffe committed its remaining fighter strength to the defense of the Reich. Brown's crew consisted of 9 other men, whose lives would depend on his decisions in the next few hours. Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke served as co-dash pilot. Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok navigated. Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews operated radio and bombardier equipment. Staff Sergeant Bertrand Coulombe manned the top turret and served as flight engineer. The waist gunners, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, and radio operator formed the defensive perimeter that kept German fighters at bay or died trying. Their bomber, B-17F serial number 423167, carried the name The Old Pub painted on its nose. A bit of English pub nostalgia that seemed harmless enough when the aircraft arrived from Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant in June 1943. None of the crew knew that the aircraft's name would become synonymous with survival, mercy, and the strange mathematics of war that sometimes allowed 10 men to live when all probability said they should die. Franz Stigler was born August 21, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria, a medieval city that had survived centuries of European conflict and would barely survive the 20th century's mechanized version. His generation inherited the trauma of Germany's defeat in World War I, the chaos of Weimar's collapse, hyperinflation that destroyed middle-class savings, political violence between communists and fascists in the streets, and the slow erosion of democratic institutions that culminated in Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. Stigler grew up in this environment, where economic desperation and national humiliation created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. But his own pathled through aviation rather than politics. He discovered flying in the early 1930s, when the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on German military aviation had created a civilian flying culture where a young man could learn to pilot aircraft without joining the banned Air Force. By the time the Luftwaffe was officially reconstituted in 1935, Stigler had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time, experiences that made him valuable to an organization that needed pilots more than it needed ideological purity. Commercial aviation in the 1930s required skills that would prove essential in combat: the ability to navigate long distances using celestial and radio navigation, to land aircraft in poor weather, to manage fuel consumption over extended flights, and to maintain situational awareness while operating complex machinery. These were not skills that could be quickly taught to novice pilots, and the Luftwaffe recognized that experienced civilian aviators like Stigler represented a resource too valuable to waste. Stigler grew up in the era of Weimar Germany's collapse, economic devastation, and the slow rise of National Socialism. He became a commercial airline pilot before the war, flying Lufthansa routes. Spitfire Mark V. The FW-19OA carried 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, heavier for power than the Bf-109, but at the cost of slightly reduced maneuverability. German fighter tactics in late 1943 emphasized overwhelming firepower applied in brief attack passes. Pilots approached bomber formations at high speed, fired from maximum effective range, and broke away before defensive runners could track them effectively. The closing speed during a head-on attack exceeded 500 miles per hour, giving defensive gunners perhaps 3 seconds to identify the target. leave the aiming point, and fire before the fighter flashed past. Most offensive fire missed entirely. The rounds that connected often struck non-critical areas or passed through the fighter without hitting vital systems. But when a 20mm cannon shell struck a bomber's engine, or penetrated the cockpit, or hit a fuel tank, the results were catastrophic and immediate. The attacks lasted more than 10 minutes, wave after wave of fighters making head-on passes, firing 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun bullets designed to penetrate heavy bombers at maximum range. The B-17's defensive guns returned fire, but several weapons jammed, frozen mechanisms failing in the extreme cold or damaged by earlier flak hits. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Samuel Blackford, found his feet going numb as electrical heating wires in his suit failed. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, died when a cannon shell struck the tail section, decapitating him instantly, filling the small compartment with blood that flash froze in the -60-degree air. The right waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Alex Yelisenko, took shrapnel in the leg, a wound that severed arteries and would have killed him in minutes, except the extreme cold caused the wound to partially clot. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Richard Pechout, was hit in the eye by a shell fragment but remained conscious, bleeding and half blind but still trying to coordinate defensive fire. Brown himself took a shell fragment in his right shoulder, a hot punch-off steel that tore muscle and tendon but somehow missed major blood vessels and the lung cavity. The aircraft's No. 3 engine lost power, reduced to half output by damage to the supercharger or oil system, or both. 3 engines down or damaged meant the old pub flew on approximately 40% of its rated power, a condition incompatible with maintaining altitude or speed. The hydraulic system failed, eliminating power to the turrets and making control inputs harder for the pilot and co-pilot. The electrical system took damage, knocking out internal lighting, navigation instruments, and the radio. Half the rudder was gone, shot away by cannon fire. The port elevator, the control surface that pitched the nose up or down, was half destroyed, leaving Brown and Luke struggling to maintain level. Flight with mismatched control surfaces and an aircraft that wanted to spiral into the ground. The morphine syrettes carried in the first aid kits had frozen solid. Wounded men endured their injurious with the painkillers, shock setting in as blood pressure dropped and body temperature fell towards that point where consciousness failed. Brown knew they were dying. The aircraft was dying. Every minute brought them closer to the moment when one more system failed. One more control surface tore away, one more engine quit, and they would fall out of the sky at his airfield near Brennan. Franz Stigler had been refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 when the air raid sirens wailed and anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The routine of aerial combat in late 1943 had become mechanized, almost industrial in its repetition. Pilots landed, reported results to intelligence officers, ate whatever food was available, and waited for the next scramble alert. Ground crews serviced the aircraft, patching bullet holes with aluminum plates, replacing damaged components, refueling tanks, and loading ammunition belts. The Bf 109's ammunition drums required manual loading, each belt hand-fed into the mechanisms that would feed rounds into the guns during the next sortie. Armament crews worked with practiced efficiency, aware that the pilot's survival often depended on reliable weapons functioning perfectly under extreme conditions. Stigler's aircraft had taken damage during an earlier mission when an American .50 caliber bullet penetrated the radiator assembly, embedding itself in the cooling system without causing immediate failure, but creating a slow leak that raised engine temperatures toward the red line. The Daimler-Benz DB605 was sensitive to reheating. Loss of coolant meant rising cylinder head temperatures, potential seizure of pistons, and catastrophic engine failure that would leave the pilot with seconds to decide between bailing out over hostile territory or attempting a dead-stick landing in whatever field or road appeared below. Stigler knew his aircraft was compromised, but combat operations in December 1943 left little room for caution. The Luftwaffe needed every available fighter in the air, and pilots flew aircraft that in peacetime would have been grounded pending major maintenance. He watched the bomber stream pass overhead, watched the flak bursts in contrails marking the battle at altitude, and knew that in a few minutes, stragglers would be limping away from the target, wounded aircraft trying to reach the North Sea and safety beyond. A Luftwaffe pilot flying an undamaged fighter against a crippled bomber could expect an easy kill. Confirmation that would count toward the scorecard that determined awards and promotions and the simple recognition that came from being good at the brutal work of aerial combat. Stigler had 27 confirmed victories. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves was awarded at 30 kills. And every German fighter pilot understood what that medal meant: recognition as one off the elite. A warrior who had proven himself in the most demanding arena imaginable. Stigler needed 3 more kills. When ground crew alerted him that a lone B-17 was passing low and slow to the east, he climbed into his Bf-109G6, started the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, and took off in pursuit. The aircraft carried standard armament for the G6 variant, 213mm MG-131, machine guns mounted above the engine cowling, and 120mm MG-151 20th cannon firing through the propeller hub. The guns are loaded, the oxygen system functioned, and the fighter responded to controls with the precision that made the Bf-109 legendary. There was only one problem. An American .50 caliber bullet had embedded itself in the radiator during an earlier mission, and Stigler knew the engine might overheat at any moment. He climbed anyway, angling toward the bomber that was flying so low it seemed to be looking for a place to crash-land. Stigler caught up to the B-17 at low altitude, approaching from behind and below, the classic position for a fighter attack that put the defender's guns out of angle and gave the attacker time to line up a killing burst. What he saw through the gun sight made him hesitate. The bomber's tail section was destroyed, aluminum skin peeled back to reveal structural members and hydraulic lines. The verticalstabilizer had taken hits that left it resembling lace more than airframe. The ball turret, a spherical gun position that hung beneath the fuselage, was motionless, the gunner either dead or incapacitated. Stigler moved his fighter to the side, pulling alongside the bomber to assess damage, and saw through torn openings in the fuselage what no tactical manual prepared him for. He could see the crew inside. Heck could see wounded men trying to administer first aid to each other. He could see the tail gunner slumped in his position, clearly dead. He could see the pilot and co-pilot struggling with the controls, their faces visible through the side windows, exhaustion and desperation written in their postures. Thebermer was flying at barely 200 miles per hour, nose slightly low, engine smoking. Control surface S responding to inputs with the sluggishness that comes from damaged linkages and shredded aluminum. This was not a combat-effective aircraft. This was 10 men inside a machine that should have already crashed, held aloft by nothing but will and the residual momentum of 4 engines that were still somehow producing thrust. Stigler remembered Gustav Rodel's words. A man in a parachute cannot fight back, cannot threaten you, is helpless in the sky awaiting whatever fate brings. To shoot such aiming was murder, not combat. Stigler looked at the B-17 and understood that the men inside were as helpless as any man dangling from silk canopy in the open air. They were already dead, unless someone chose to let them live. Stigler did not fire. He could have put a burst into the number 1 engine, the only engine on the port side still running at something close to full power. A single 3-second burst from his 20mm cannon would have destroyed that engine, and with 3 of 4 engines dead or damaged. The B-17 would have lost altitude immediately, spiraling into the German countryside below, where it would impact in a fireball of aviation gasoline and exploding ammunition. The crew would have died on impact or burned in the wreckage. Stigler would have claimed his 28th confirmed victory. German fighter pilots operated under a scoring system that required confirmation from witnesses other pilots. Ground observers or gun camera footage showing the enemy aircraft's destruction. A bomber falling out of formation and crashing constituted unambiguous confirmation. The victory would have counted towards Stigler's total, moving him 3 kills closer to the Knight's Cross, the decoration that marked a pilot acolyte. As someone who had proven himself repeatedly in the most dangerous environment imaginable. Awards mattered in the Luftwaffe. They represented professional recognition, brought privileging leave time and priority for choice assignments, and carried social prestige that extended beyond military circles into civilian society. A Knight's Cross recipient commanded respect, deference, and the attention of superiors who determined promotions and post-war careers. Stigler understood all of this. He understood what he was giving up by not pulling the trigger. But understanding the cost of mercy did not change the fundamental reality. He saw through the torn aluminum of that bomber fuselage. Those men were dying already. Adding more death served no purpose except professional advent. And Stigler had absorbed Gustav Rodel's teaching deeply enough to recognize that some victories cost more than they gained. It could have raked the fuselage with cannon fire, killing their remaining crew. He could have claimed his 28th victory and flown home to congratulations. The recognition that came from professional competence in the trade of killing. Instead, Franz Stigler moved his fighter into formation with the bomber, positioning his Bf-109 on the B-17's port wing, close enough that the American pilot could see him clearly. Brown and Luke saw the German fighter pull alongside, saw the black crosses on its wings, the yellow nose marking typical of Luftwaffers, and waited for the cannon fire that would end everything. It did not come. Stigler gestured with his hands, trying to communicate something the Americans did not understand. He pointed north toward Sweden. He pointed down toward Germany. He made landing gestures, trying to tell them to put the bomber down on German soil, surrender, and get medical treatment for their wounded. The Americans stared at him, uncomprehending, too exhausted and too shocked to process what was happening. Brown shook his head. They were going home, or they were going to die trying. Stigler understood the gesture, even if words were impossible across the roar of engines and the gap between aircraft. He stayed in formation. The B-17 flew west, toward the North Sea, toward England. Toward safety that was still 250 miles away across water, where ditching meant death from hypothermia in minutes. Stigler followed, maintaining position on the bomber's wing. He understood the danger of what he was doing. If another Luftwaffe pilot saw him escorting an enemy bomber, questions would arise. If his squadron commander learned of this, a court-martial was probable. If the wrong officers heard about it, execution was possible. The Luftwaffe, like all military organizations in late 1943, had become increasingly fanatical as the war turned against Germany. Mercy was not a concept that appeared in tactical doctrine or official orders, but Stigler also understood that the bomber was flying low enough and slow enough that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would see it as an easy target. The standing order for Flak Batarius was to fire on any unidentified aircraft, and a lone B-17 at low altitude would draw fire from every gun crew that spotted it. By flying in close formation with the bomber, Stigler created confusion. German gunners would see a Bf-109 escorting the bomber and hesitate, uncertain whether the American aircraft was a prize being brought down by a skilled pilot or whether the fighter was damaged and being escorted by the bomber. That moment of uncertainty might be enough. Stigler stayed in formation, his presence the only shield between the Americans and every flak gun between Bremen and the coast. They crossed into occupied territory, passed over Dutch farmland where resistance fighters and German garrison troops played a deadly game of raid and reprisal, flew over the Frisian Islands where a coastal artillery scanned the sky for exactly this kind of target. Stigler watched the bomber struggle, watched its pilots fighting to keep the nose up as airspeed decayed and the aircraft approached stall speed. He saw the ball turret gunner moving, still alive in that tiny sphere of aluminum and plexiglass suspended beneath the fuselage where temperatures and exposure made survival a matter of endurance as much as armor. He saw the waist gunner's shifting position, tending to the wounded, trying to keep men alive who had lost too much blood and whose body temperatures were dropping into the zone where their heart stops and consciousness fades into the long, cold dark that comes before death. Stigler could have broken away at any time. He could have let the bomber fend for itself, return to base, and reported nothing. Instead, he held position, shepherding the crippled aircraft toward the North Sea, toward international waters, where his presence became irrelevant, and the Americans would either make it to England or die in the attempt. They reached the coast. The North Sea stretched gray and cold to the horizon, 250 miles of open water that no crippled bomber had ever successfully crossed. Brown turned the aircraft west, pointed the nose toward England, and committed to the attempt. Stigler pulled his fighter close one last time, close enough that Brown could see his face through the canopy, see the German pilot looking back at him with an expression that held no hatred, no triumph, only the acknowledgement that they were both men doing impossible things in a war neither of them had wanted. Stigler raised his hand in a salute, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another, a recognition that survival today did not erase the fact that tomorrow they might meet again in combat and one would kill the other. Then he broke formation, banked his Bf-109 into a hard turn, and dove for the deck, racing back toward German airspace before anyone could track his position and ask questions he did not want to answer. Brown aimed the dorsal turret at Stigler's fighter, following the German aircraft with the turret's twin 50 caliber guns as it broke away. The gunner waited for the order to fire. Brown watched Stigler's fighter recede into the distance, watched the German pilot fly back toward a coastline studded with anti-aircraft batteries and a homeland that was burning under a strategic bombing campaign that would eventually kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. Brown did not give the order to fire. Stigler had let him live. Brown would extend the same mercy, or at least the recognition that some debts transcended the requirements of military duty. The German fighter disappeared into the haze over the Dutch coast. The old pub flew on alone, engines straining, airframe groaning. 10 men holding together a machinette that had no structural right to remain airborne. The flight across the North Sea took hours. Each minute a negotiation between available engine power and the remorseless mathematics of drag, weight, and diminishing altitude. The North Sea in Decemberment, water temperatures hovering just above freezing, waves driven by Atlantic storms, and survival times measured in single-digit minutes for anyone unlucky enough to ditch and survive the impact. B-17 crews carried Mae West life jackets and inflatable rafts, equipment that improved survival odds from 0 to minimal in winter waters. The reality of ditching a 4-engine bomber was well understood by December 1943. The aircraft's weight and speed made controlled water landings nearly impossible. Most ditchings resulted in the aircraft breaking apart on impact, the fuselage snapping at weak points near the bomb bay or tail section, crew compartments flooding instantly, and survivors struggling to escape through torn openings, while frigid water filled their lungs and dragged them down into darkness. Air-sea rescue services operating out of England maintained flying boat and surface vessel patrols in the North Sea, but finding survivors in winter weather required luck more than Skill. Radio distress calls from aircraft rarely included precise position information because navigation equipment was often damaged, and crews too busy trying to survive to calculate exact coordinates. Search areas stretched across hundreds of square miles of gray water, indistinguishable from gray sky. The men flying the old pub understood that if they went down over water, rescue was possible but improbable, and survival depended entirely on reaching the English coast before altitude ran out or their remaining engines quit. Brown and Luke worked the controls with mechanical precision learned through hundreds of hours of training and refined through the immediate education that comes from flying damaged aircraft under combat conditions. They knew the B-17's flight envelope, understood how much altitude they could trade for airspeed, calculated fuel consumption against distance remaining, and made continuous adjustments to power settings and trim that kept the aircraft flying when every aerodynamic principle suggested it should have fallen from the sky. Brown and Luke worked the controls, coaxing lift from damaged wings, balancing asymmetric thrust from engines that were running on fuel vapors and the residual momentum of machinery that had been asked to perform beyond design specifications. They descended slowly, losing altitude despite full throttle on their remaining engines, trading height for distance in the hope that they could reach England before the aircraft ran out of sky. The wounded men lay where they had fallen, tended by crew members who had turned up clothing to make bandages and who shared body heat to keep each other from sliding into hypothermia and unconsciousness. The dead tail gunner remained in his position, frozen in place, his blood crystallized on the torn aluminum around him. The crew did not speak much. There was nothing to say that would change the situation. They flew because there was no alternative, because giving up meant death, because 10 men in a dying aircraft over a freezing ocean did not have the luxury of despair. Land appeared as a dark line on the horizon, the eastern coast of England. Salvation in the form of muddy fields and scattered villages, and somewhere in that patchwork landscape, an airfield where they could put down and end this impossible flight. Brown aimed for RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group. Not his assigned base, but the closest field with runways long enough to accommodate a crippled bomber making an emergency landing. He descended toward the field, lowered the landing gear manually because hydraulic power was gone, lined up on the runway using visual reference beckets. Most of the instruments were inoperative, and brought the old pub down with a landing that was more controlled crash than textbook approach. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Brown cut the engine start in the sudden silence, punctuated only by the ticking of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. The crew began the process of exiting the aircraft and discovering who was still alive. 9 men walked or were carried from the old pub that afternoon. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, remained in his position, beyond the reach of medics and chaplains and the official notifications that will eventually reach his family in Pennsylvania. The debriefing followed standard procedure. Brown reported the mission details, the flak damage, the fighter attacks, the casualties, and finally, the strange encounter with a German fighter that had escorted them rather than finished them. The intelligence officer wrote it down, nodded, and filed the report. The details were classified because information about Luftwaffe tactics and pilot behavior had intelligence value, and because the fact that a German pilot had shown mercy raised questions about enemy morale and internal discipline that psychological warfare analysts wanted to study. Brown did not speak about it again for decades. Stigler did not speak of it at all. Franz Stigler returned to his base at Brennan, landed his damaged Bf-109, and told no one what he hadn't. The culture of the Luftwaffe in late 1943 had shifted from the relatively professional military organization of the war's early years to something harder, more desperate, and less tolerant of actions that could be interpreted as weakness or defeatism. Germany was losing the war. Soviet forces were grinding through the Eastern Front, destroying German armies in battles of attrition that consumed entire divisions. Allied forces controlled North Africa and Italy. The strategic bombing campaign was reducing German industrial capacity, killing civilian workers, and destroying the infrastructure that supported military operations. In this environment, military discipline became increasingly rigid. Officers watched for signs of defeatism among their men. Political officers monitored conversations for evidence of doubt about final victory. Acts that might have been overlooked in 1940 or 1941 now carried severe consequences. Allowing an enemy bomber to escape could be interpreted as dereliction off duty, cowardice, or even sabotage. Court-martial proceedings in the Luftwaffe had become perfunctory exercises that often ended with execution for offenses that earlier in the war would have resulted in reprimands or reassignment. Stigler understood this reality. He understood that speaking about what he had done would invite questions he could not answer satisfactorily, would require explaining a decision that violated standing orders and tactical doctrine, and would mark him as someone whose loyalty or judgment was suspect. Silence was safer. He filed routine reports, flew additional missions, and kept the secret of December 20th, 1943, locked away in memory where no interrogator could reach it. In the Luftwaffe of late 1943, failure to kill an enemy when opportunity presented itself was considered dereliction of duty. Allowing an enemy bomber to escape when you had the position and armament to destroy it approached treason. Stigler filed a routine mission report, claimed no kills, and kept his silence. He flew more missions as the war continued its trajectory toward Germany's eventual collapse. In 1944, Stigler transferred to Jagdverband 44, an elite unit formed to fly the Messerschmitt May 262 jet fighter, a revolutionary aircraft that was too little and too late to change Germany's fate, but which gave German pilots a brief technological edge in the Sky War. Stigler served the war, survived the occupation, and in 1953 emigrated to Canada, where he built a successful business and raised a family and did not talk about his time as a fighter pilot except in devious terms. Some memories were too complicated, too morally ambiguous, to share with people who had not been there. Charlie Brown returned to the United States after completing his combat tour, served again in the newly formed U.S. Air Force from 1949 to 1965, worked as a State Department Foreign Service officer in Laos and Vietnam during the worst years of those conflicts, and retired to Florida in 1972 to become an inventor. The men who had flown with him on December 20th, 1943, scattered across America, some being young from delayed effects of combat trauma, and others living into old age with memories that never quite faded. The bomber the old pub returned to the United States in April 1944, was judged too damaged for further combat service, and was scrapped in August 1945, along with thousands of other aircraft rendered surplus by victory. The aluminum was melted down and repurposed, the engine esselved, the serial number recorded in archives that documented every B-17 built during the war. The aircraft was forgotten by everyone except the men who had flown in it and the German pilot who had chosen not to destroy it. 40 years passed. The world transformed in those decades, moving from total war to Cold War, from conventional bombing to nuclear standoff, from propeller-driven aircraft to jets and missiles. The generation that fought World War II aged, raised families, built careers, and carried memories that didn't fade with time, but instead acquired weight and complexity as the years added perspective and distance. Charlie Brown, now a retired lieutenant colonel, attended a combat pilot reunion in 1986 at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. part of a series of Gathering of the Eagles events where veterans shared their experiences with younger generations. These reunions served multiple purposes. They allowed veterans to reconnect with men they had served alongside, to remember friends who hadn't survived, and to process experiences that civilian life rarely acknowledged or understood. They also provided educational value, bringing combat veterans into contact with active duty pilots, while benefited from hearing first-hand accounts of aerial warfare from men who had actually done it. The Air Force recognized that institutional knowledge resided in these aging veterans. The tactical lessons learned over Europe and the Pacific had continuing relevance, and that preserving oral history mattered for the generation that had fought the war passed into history themselves. Brown attended these events regularly, speaking to classes at Air Command and Staff College, sharing stories about formation flying and defensive tactics and the grinding attrition of the daylight bombing campaign. Most of his stories were unremarkable. The standard narratives of military aviation, flak encounters, mechanical failures, crew coordination, the fear that preceded every mission, and the relief that followed successful returns. But one story remained different, unusual enough that Brown had rarely told it, strange enough that he wondered sometimes whether he had remembered it correctly or whether trauma and time had distorted the memory into something that made no tactical sense. Someone asked Brown if he had any memorable missions during the war. He thought about it, sifted through memories of flaking fighters and the grinding terror of formation flying through German defenses, and found himself telling the story he had not told in decades. He described a crippled bomber, the German fighter pulling alongside, the salute, the safe passage to the North Sea. The room went silent. After the presentation, several veterans suggested Brown should try to find the German pilot to close the circle in a story that seemed too strange to have happened and too specific to have been imagined. Brown began his search with military records, contacting the U.S. Air Force, the West German Bundeswehr, and various veteran associations in both countries. The records were fragmented, incomplete, compromised by the chaos of war's end and the administrative reality that neither country had maintained perfect documentation of every combat sortie flown during 6 years of total war. After 4 years of searching, Brown had learned nothing useful. He wrote a letter to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter describing the incident and asking if anyone had information about a Luftwaffe pilot who might have spared a B-17 near Bremen on December 20, 1943. He included details only someone present could know: the black crosses on the fighter's wings, the yellow nose marking the altitude and location, the salute. The letter reached Franz Stigler in Canada. Stigler read it, recognized his own long-held secret reflected in someone else's words, and understood that after 40 years, desolence could end. He wrote back, "I was the one." They spoke on the phone, two old men whose voices carried the weight of decades and the accumulated sins that comes from surviving a war that killed millions. Stigler described his fighter, the damaged radiator, the decision not to fire, the escort to the coast. Brown confirmed every detail, adding his own memories of watching the German fighter pull alongside, of not understanding what the pilot wanted, of the salute before the Bf-109 turned back toward Germany. The details matched. This was not coincidence or false memory. This was confirmation that the impossible thing had actually happened, that in the midst of total war, one man had looked at 10 others and made a choice that all tactical doctrine said was wrong, but that some older code insisted was necessary. They met in person. They became friends, the kind of friendship that forms between men who share a secret so profound that no one else can fully understand it. Between 1990 and 2008, Brown and Stigler attended air shows together, gave joint presentations, and collaborated with author Adam Makos on the book A Higher Call. which documented their story for a generation that had never experienced strategic bombing or dogfights at 30,000 feet. They appeared on television, spoke at military academies, and answered the question that everyone asked: why did you spare them? Stigler's answer never changed. To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them, and I couldn't shoot them down. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at the age of 92, in Vancouver, Canada. Surrounded by family who knew him as a successful businessman, and only late in his life learned the full story of what he had done over Germany in 1943. Charlie Brown died November 24, 2008, 8 months after Stigler, in Miami, Florida, at the age of 86. The men who had flown with him on December 20, 1943, predeceased him, the last survivor being waist gunner Lloyd Jennings, who died in 2016. In 2008, following a request from Brown, the surviving crew members of the old pub were each awarded the Silver Star, the United States military's third highest decoration for valor in combat. Brown himself received the Air Force Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, in recognition of extraordinary heroism. The awards came 65 years after the fact, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that sometimes history needs time to understand what happened and why it mattered. The story raises questions that military historians and ethicists still debate. Stigler violated standing orders and tactical doctrine. He allowed an enemy bomber to escape, prolonging the crew's ability to return to combat and participate in future missions against Germany. His decision to escort the bomber could be interpreted as aiding the enemy, an action punishable by death under Luftwaffe regulations. Yet Gustav Rodel's code, the old Prussian warrior ethic that separated killing in combat from murder oft helpless, recognized a distinction that modern warfare had tried to erase. Total war demanded total commitment, absolute ruthlessness, the willingness to kill without hesitation or mercy, because the enemy would do the same, and victory required matching their determination. But Stigler proved that even in total war, individual choice remained possible. He could have fired. He chose not to. That choice cost him nothing tangible, the Knight's Cross he might have earned, the recognition that came with being a 30-kill ace, but it preserved something else, something that cannot be measured in score sheets or mission reports. It preserved his own humanity, his ability to look at himself in the mirror for the next 65 years and know that when faced with the choice between murder and mercy, he had chosen the harder path. The B-17 bomber force lost approximately 4,750 aircraft during the war, with casualty rates among bomber crews exceeding 50% for certain periods of intense combat. The statistical probability of completing a 25-mission combat tour in 1943 was approximately 1 in 3. Odds that would have been unacceptable in any rational military planning model, but which the United States accepted because strategic bombing doctrine required it. Every mission became a negotiation with death, and survival often came down to chance, mechanical reliability, and the unpredictable decisions of enemy pilots who held life and death in the pressure of a trigger finger. Stigler's decision represented an outlier, a moment when the statistical model broke down and individual agency reasserted itself. One fighter pilot, one bomber crew, one choice that violated probability and changed 2 lives in ways neither man understood at the time. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 70,000 pilots during the war, men who flew and died in defense of a regime whose crimes made the question of honor complicated beyond measure. Stigler was not a Nazi. He was a professional pilot who served his country and flew in combat because that was what men of his generation and training did when their nation went to war. The question of whether mercy in combat absolves participation in an unjust war remains unresolved. because individual acts of humanity do not erase institutional evil. And good men serving bad cow shave, trouble philosophers, since warfare became an organized human activity. Stigler understood this complexity. He did not claim moral superiority. He simply said he could not shoot helpless men, and that distinction mattered to him more than medals or recognition. The encounter between the old pub and Franz Stigler's Bf-109 lasted less than 30 minutes. A brief intersection of trajectories in a war that lasted 6 years and killed 60 million people. Military historians studying World War II focus primarily on major operations invasions. Campaigns, decisive battles that altered strategic balance and determined the war's outcome. Individual encounters between single fighters and bombers rarely merit more than statistical footnotes in the larger narrative of aerial warfare. Yet the Stigler-Brown incident reveals something about warfare that strategic analysis often misses: that combat situations create moral dilemmas requiring individual decisions that doctrine and training cannot fully address. Every fighter pilot approaching a damaged bomber faced the same tactical situation Stigler encountered. The bomber is helpless, the kill is certain, the professional reward is measurable. Standard operating procedure dictated finishing the enemy whenever opportunity presented itself. Resources invested in training bomber crews, building the aircraft, and mounting the mission represented substantial allied expenditure that could only be negated by destroying the crew and aircraft before they returned to base. From a purely military perspective, allowing the bomber to escape was irrational, potentially allowing the crew to return to combat and participate in future missions against German targets. This logic supported the kill-on-sight mentality that governed most aerial combat. But Stigler had absorbed a different code from Gustav Radl, one that recognized limits to what warriors should do even in service of military necessity. The concept of warrior honor, the idea that certain actions degraded the man who committed them regardless of military justification, derived from older European military traditions that emphasize personal conduct and professional standards independent of political objectives. These traditions had eroded steadily through the 20th century as warfare became increasingly industrialized, mechanized, and total. World War II accelerated this erosion. Strategic bombing deliberately targeted civilian populations. Submarine warfare sank merchant ships without warning. Artillery barrages destroyed entire cities. The scale and brutality of conflict seemed to justify any action that advanced victory. Yet individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines continued to make moral choices in circumstances where such choices were neither required nor expected by their commands. It did not change the outcome of any battle, did not shift strategic advantage, did not appear in any history of the air war over Europe until decades after the fact. Yet it endured in the memories of two men who could not forget it, who carried it through the years like an exploded ordnance that remained dangerous because it challenged every assumption about how enemies behaved and what war required of those who fought it. The paradox at the center of history, that an enemy saved you when killing you would have been easier and more professionally advantageous, suggested that even in the worst circumstances, human choice retained meaning. Stigler chose mercy. Brown chose not to fire on the departing fighter. Both men acknowledged that they had been participants in something larger than tactical decisions or military necessity, something that spaghetto codes older than national flags or political ideologies. A surviving B-17, serial number 448543, operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Madras, Oregon, was repainted in 2019 to replicate the old pub, complete with nose art and markings that matched. The original aircraft Brown flew on December 20th, 1943. The decision to preserve this specific aircraft's identity through Accurate restoration reflects the broader effort to maintain physical connections to World War II. History, as the generation that fought the war passes away. Museums and private collections maintain approximately 15 airworthy B-17s worldwide. Aircraft that survived the war escaped scrapping and were eventually restored to flying condition through decades of work by dedicated teams of mechanics, historians, and volunteers. Each aircraft represents an investment measuring in millions of dollars and thousands of hours of labor. Maintaining a B-17 in airworthy condition requires sourcing parts that are no longer manufactured, fabricating components using original specifications and materials, and adhering to maintenance standards that ensure safety while preserving historical authenticity. The Raider 182 Cyclone engines require specialized knowledge to maintain. Airframe components wear out and must be replaced using techniques that match 1940s. Manufacturing methods. Control systems, hydraulics, electrical wiring, and hundreds of other subsystems demand continuous attention to prevent failures that could ground the aircraft or endanger crews during demonstration flights. The restoration of serial number 48543 as the old pub service educational purposes, allowing people who have no direct connection to World War II to experience the physical reality of the bomber campaign, the noise, vibration, cramped crew positions, and simple mechanical presence of a four-engine heavy bomber. Flight experiences in these restored aircraft provide visceral understanding that photographs and documents cannot convey. Passengers climbing into the ball turret understand immediately why that position was simultaneously vital and terrifying. Standing in the waist gunner positions with wind howling through open windows makes clear the extreme conditions crews endured on every mission. The aircraft becomes a teaching tool, a physical artifact that communicates historical reality through direct experience rather than abstract description. The aircraft flies in air shows and provides historic flight experiences, allowing people to understand what it was like to sit in the cockpit of a four-engine bomber, to hear the thunder of Wright's Cyclone engines, to feel the vibration of a machine that was built for one purpose and performed that purpose at terrible cost to the men who crewed it. The restoration preserves memory in aluminum and rivets, a physical artifact that connects present to past and reminds us that history happened to real people in real machines that flew through real danger. When the aircraft flies, it carries with it the ghost of 10 men who flew the old pub through flak and fighters and made it home because one German pilot looked at them and saw not targets but men. The encounter did not end the war or save other lives. It was singular, unrepeatable, the product of specific circumstances that aligned in a way that probability said should never happen. But it mattered to the men involved, and through them. It matters to everyone who hears the story and understands that even in the mechanized slaughter of total war, individual human choice remained the final variable. Stigler could have pulled the trigger. He chose not to. That choice echoed across 40 years until Thessalon's broke, and two old men met and confirmed that the impossible thing had been real. They became friends not because friendship erased what they had been to each other in 1943, but because they recognized in each other the burden of memory that only someone who had been there could understand. They were enemies who had become witnesses to each other's humanity, and that transformation required acknowledging something difficult, that the man trying to kill you might ousted the man who would save you, and that war's moral calculus broke down when you looked another human being in the eyes and understood that he was making the same impossible choices you were. The Stigler-Brown story endures not because it was typical, but precisely because it was exceptional, an outlier that proved the possibility of mercy even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. Modern military ethicists study the incident as a case study in moral agency under extreme conditions. The decisions both men made, Stigler choosing not to fire Brown choosing not to shoot the departing fighter illustrate that training and doctrine create frameworks for action, but cannot eliminate individual moral responsibility. Warriors make choices. Those choices define them more thoroughly than the wars they fight in or the causes they serve. The fact that Stigler and Brown found each other 40 years after the incident, that they confirmed the details and became friends, transforms what might have been dismissed as anecdote or myth into documented history. Their reunion validated memory, proved that extraordinary acts of humanity occur, even in total war, and demonstrated that reconciliation when former enemies requires acknowledging shared experience that transcends national identities and political ideologies. The story continues to resonate because it offers an alternative to the binary thinking that reduces warfare to simple categories of friend and enemy, victory and defeat, right and wrong. War is more complex than propaganda admits, and the men who fight wars are more than the uniforms they wear or the flags they serve. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.